Something has shifted, and it didn't ask for permission. There is a version of you that no longer waits for certainty, approval, or explanation. It moves before hesitation forms. It acts before doubt learns your name. Quietly, something deeper has stepped forward and taken command. Not with emotion, not with struggle, but with absolute clarity. The old sense of control, the one built from overthinking and reaction, is no longer leading. A higher layer is now organizing your choices, your timing, your direction. And it doesn't negotiate with noise, it only follows alignment. What you are witnessing does not change. It is a takeover, a silent quantum reconfiguration where a more coherent version of you is now running the system. The first sign: decision happens before thought. The first noticeable shift is not loud. It does not arrive with clarity or explanation. It appears in a much quieter way, almost unnoticeable at first, like something inside you has already finished moving before you realize movement was even possible. There is a moment where the usual internal process of thinking, analyzing, comparing, and hesitating is no longer fully involved in how you act. In the past, a decision would form through layers. Observation leads to thought, thought leads to evaluation, evaluation leads to hesitation or approval, and only then action begins. That sequence feels natural when you are inside it. But when the inner structure begins to change, that sequence starts breaking in subtle ways. Now, something different happens. A direction appears fully formed before language can shape it. You notice yourself already leaning toward something, already knowing what will be done, without having walked through the mental steps that used to be required. It is not impulsive in the emotional sense. It is not random. It feels settled before it becomes conscious. The interesting part is that thought still tries to arrive, but it arrives late. It shows up after the internal movement has already been set. It tries to explain what has already been decided. It tries to create reasons for something that no longer needs reasons to begin. This creates a strange inner silence. Not emptiness, but completion, as if the system inside you is no longer waiting for mental approval before it moves. The decision is no longer generated by thinking, it is simply recognized by it after the fact. Hesitation begins to lose its structure. Not because fear disappears, but because it no longer gets the time it used to have. The gap between impulse and action becomes thinner, almost invisible. And in that thin space, something deeper is operating. Something that does not debate, does not loop, does not delay. You start noticing small things first. You reach for something without questioning why. You respond to situations without rehearsing outcomes. You choose words before you mentally construct them. And when you reflect afterward, you realize the choice was already complete long before awareness caught up. This is not about losing control. It is about discovering that control was never as centralized as you believed. There is a deeper layer of processing that does not use argument or inner dialogue. It simply aligns conditions internally and produces direction without verbal steps. The mind, in this phase, becomes more like an observer than a decision maker. It watches what is already happening and tries to map it afterward. It is still present, but it is no longer leading the sequence. Something underneath it has already taken that role. And the most subtle but important sign is this: you stop feeling the weight of choosing. Not because life becomes easier, but because choice stops feeling like construction. It begins to feel like recognition. As if you are no longer building decisions, you are discovering the one that is already formed. Something fundamental changes in how reality is experienced internally. Actions feel cleaner, timing feels immediate, and thought becomes secondary to an underlying coherence that does not require explanation to operate. This is the first sign. Not a dramatic transformation, but a structural one. A place where decisions no longer wait for thought to approve them, because something deeper has already completed the process before thought even enters the room. The mind loses its steering privilege. Something subtle but irreversible begins to happen. The mind is still active, still producing thoughts, still analyzing, still trying to map outcomes. But it is no longer the origin point of movement. It becomes more like a secondary layer, observing what is already unfolding rather than initiating it. You may notice this in simple moments first. A question appears, but the answer is already forming before you finish asking it internally. A choice presents itself, but the direction is already leaning forward before reasoning arrives to approve it. The usual sequence, observe, compare, calculate, decide, starts to collapse into a compressed experience where action is already aligned before explanation shows up. This is not confusion. It is not loss of control in the ordinary sense. It is a relocation of control deeper than thought can access. The mind, which once acted like a steering mechanism, begins to realize it is no longer holding the wheel. It can still comment, it can still narrate, but it is no longer the system that determines direction. What replaces it is not silence, but a different kind of intelligence, non-verbal, non-linear, immediate. It does not argue with possibilities, it selects outcomes through coherence. It does not weigh options, it recognizes what is already settled beneath the surface of mental activity. Overthinking begins to feel strangely disconnected from reality, not because thinking becomes wrong, but because it becomes late. The decision has already moved through a deeper layer before thought can frame it. The mind arrives after the fact, trying to explain a direction that has already been taken. This creates a new internal hierarchy. Thought is no longer the driver, it becomes an interpreter, a translator of something that has already occurred at a quieter level of processing. You may still use it for language, for structure, for communication, but not for initiation. A strange clarity appears. Fewer internal debates, fewer loops of contradiction, fewer moments of being pulled in opposite directions. Not because complexity disappears, but because it is no longer being processed at the surface level where conflict used to form. What you begin to notice is simple but profound. Life starts moving without asking for permission from hesitation. The inner system acts first, and the mind follows later, trying to describe a decision that was already complete before language arrived. This is the moment the steering privilege dissolves, not taken away, relocated. And once it shifts, it does not return to its old position, because you begin to recognize something unmistakable. Clarity was never created by thinking harder. It was always coming from somewhere deeper than thought was designed to reach. The invisible layer that starts moving first. Before anything becomes visible in your external life, something already shifts in a layer that cannot be easily described in normal thinking. It is not emotion, not logic, not intuition in the usual sense. It is a quieter operational level, one that begins to reorganize direction before you become aware that direction has changed. You do not decide in this layer. You do not think through options. Instead, movement begins without announcement. A preference forms before preference has language. A direction stabilizes before you can justify it. A separation from certain paths happens before you consciously reject them. It feels less like choosing and more like reality quietly removing unnecessary branches from your experience. The mind tries to catch up. It looks for reasons. It attempts to reconstruct why something feels different, why certain people, ideas, or directions no longer hold the same weight. But the explanation always arrives late, because the shift did not originate in explanation. It originated in a pre-verbal coordination layer where outcomes are already being sorted by coherence rather than effort. This invisible layer behaves like a silent filter running beneath perception. It does not debate possibilities, it narrows them. It does not evaluate futures, it discards those that do not match the current internal configuration. And the most important part is this: it does all of this without asking your conscious mind for approval. You may notice this in how certain actions simply do not initiate anymore. Things you once forced yourself to do now lose the internal impulse that used to push them forward. Not because of resistance, but because the initiating signal never appears. The energy that used to create trying is no longer available for those directions. Other movements begin to feel strangely self-propelled. You find yourself leaning toward them without internal debate. Not urgency, not excitement, just inevitability. As if the action has already been approved somewhere deeper, and your conscious awareness is simply being informed after the fact. This creates a very specific experience. Life feels as if it is starting to organize itself from underneath your awareness. Not randomly, not externally imposed, but internally coordinated at a level that precedes thought. You are no longer constructing every step. You are witnessing steps emerge already structured. The most striking part of this layer is its lack of noise. There is no internal argument, no dramatic signal, no emotional announcement that something is changing. It is quiet, almost neutral. And because it is quiet, it is easy to miss until you notice that certain patterns have already stopped repeating without you consciously stopping them. What used to require effort now simply does not activate. What used to feel uncertain now either stabilizes quickly or dissolves entirely. The system is no longer holding everything open at once. It is continuously selecting, continuously narrowing, continuously aligning before awareness arrives. Something shifts in how you relate to your own experience. You stop assuming that thought is the first layer of reality. You begin to sense that thought is actually a later translation of something that has already moved beneath it. This is the invisible layer in motion, the part of you that starts deciding before you ever enter the decision. Effort begins to lose its function. In the internal shift where effort does not disappear, but it stops behaving like a necessary engine. It is still available in the background, yet it is no longer the force that determines whether something moves forward or not. The system begins to operate on a different principle, one where movement is initiated by alignment rather than pressure. This is easy to misunderstand. The mind assumes that progress must always feel like pushing, adjusting, forcing, or maintaining momentum. That model stays active for a while even after the deeper layer has already changed. So you may still try to apply effort to things that are no longer responding to effort as the driving mechanism. And then something strange becomes noticeable. Effort produces less return, not because you are weaker, and not because conditions are harder, but because the system you are interacting with is no longer primarily responsive to force. It is responding to coherence. And coherence cannot be manufactured through strain. It either exists or it doesn't. This is where the internal experience begins to split into two modes. In one mode, effort still functions in familiar ways, pushing, planning, calculating. In the other mode, things begin to move without being pushed. Decisions land without being forced. Outcomes unfold without being dragged into place. And the contrast between these two modes becomes impossible to ignore. You may notice that when you try harder, things become slightly more resistant, almost as if the system is not rejecting you, but simply not recognizing effort as the correct input anymore. Meanwhile, when you are not forcing anything, certain things begin to align naturally, almost quietly assembling themselves around your state without demand or pressure. This is the key transition. Effort stops being the origin of movement and becomes, at most, a tool for refinement after movement has already begun. You are no longer using effort to create direction. You are using awareness to recognize direction, and only then applying action where it is naturally supported. Unnecessary effort begins to feel heavy, not because life becomes easier in a superficial sense, but because you can feel the mismatch between force and flow more clearly. It is as if part of you is still trying to operate an older system that the deeper intelligence has already moved beyond. What replaces effort as the primary driver is a quieter mechanism, instant recognition of what is already stable. Instead of building outcomes through repetition, you begin selecting from what already feels structurally correct. Action becomes less like construction and more like alignment with something that is already partially formed. Even desire changes its texture here. Instead of pushing you forward with urgency, it begins to feel like a directional pull. Not a demand, but a resonance. And when resonance is present, effort becomes minimal, almost secondary, because the path does not require constant correction. This is also where struggle begins to lose its meaning. Not because challenges vanish, but because the internal need to fight against every step dissolves. You start noticing that forcing something into existence often creates more delay than simply allowing the correct configuration to reveal itself. A new intelligence becomes obvious. The system does not reward effort, it responds to alignment. Effort can still function, but it is no longer the language reality listens to first. It is more like a manual override that is rarely needed once the deeper layer is active. Life starts to feel less like something you are constantly building and more like something you are participating in. Effort is no longer the center of movement. It becomes a background tool, used only when necessary, while the real direction is carried by something quieter, faster, and already in place before you try to shape it. Time stops feeling external. Time stops behaving like something outside of you that you are moving through. It no longer feels like a fixed structure pressing against your life from the outside. Instead, it begins to feel like something that is being generated from within the same field that is producing your thoughts, your choices, and your sense of direction. Earlier in the old configuration, time had weight. It felt like pressure. There was always before, after, late, running out, not enough. Every decision was partially measured against an invisible clock that existed outside your awareness but controlled your urgency. Even rest was not free from it, because the mind kept tracking what had not been done yet. But as the internal layer reorganizes, that external clock begins to lose influence. Not because time disappears, but because it stops acting as the main reference point for movement. You are no longer organizing your life around time first, you are organizing it around the state. This creates a very specific shift in perception. Instead of asking, "When should I do this?" something deeper begins to answer automatically with "it is ready" or "it is not ready." Timing becomes a quality of alignment rather than a slot on a schedule. Some actions feel complete before they begin. Others cannot be forced into motion no matter how much time is allocated to them. The feeling of delay changes. Waiting no longer feels like sitting inside time. It feels like staying outside of readiness. And when readiness appears, movement feels immediate, almost as if time adjusts itself around the action, instead of the action being forced into time. You also begin to notice that certain moments expand while others collapse. A single moment of clarity can feel dense, complete, almost outside measurement. Meanwhile, periods of distraction or misalignment feel fragmented and thin, as if time itself is not fully holding them in place. This is because your attention is no longer being divided across the timeline in the same way. It is anchoring directly into what is coherent now. Planning begins to lose its rigid dominance, not because planning becomes useless, but because it is no longer treated as the source of certainty. You can plan, but you no longer depend on plans to feel oriented. The real orientation comes from a deeper sensing of whether something is aligned in the present field, not whether it fits into a future slot. This is where urgency begins to dissolve. Urgency is a time-based signal. It only exists when the mind believes that something important is being threatened by distance in time. But when internal alignment becomes the primary guide, urgency loses its function. Things are no longer urgent in the same emotional way. They are either aligned now or not active yet. Even memory and anticipation begin to shift. The past stops pulling as strongly because it is no longer the main reference for identity. The future stops pressing because it is no longer the main source of motivation. Both begin to soften into the background, while the present moment becomes the only operational space where decisions actually form. Something subtle but powerful becomes clear. Time was never the driver of your life. It was the container you used when internal signals were unclear. Once the internal layer becomes coherent, time stops being the authority and becomes only a coordinate system, not a force. Nothing dramatic may seem to change. You still move through hours, still meet deadlines, still follow sequences. But internally, the experience is no longer that you are inside time. It is that time is moving through a stable field that you are no longer resisting or chasing. Something settles deeply. You were never late, never early, never behind. You were simply operating under a system where time felt external. Now that perception dissolves, and movement begins to follow something far quieter than clocks. An inner timing that does not measure, but knows. Actions start feeling pre-remembered. Something unusual begins to happen with action itself. It stops feeling like something you are initiating in real time and starts feeling like something that has already been settled somewhere beneath awareness. The experience changes from, "I am deciding what to do to this," is already what is being done through me. This can feel subtle, almost easy to dismiss. You might notice that before you consciously decide to do something, your body has already begun orienting toward it. A movement starts before the thought fully forms. A direction becomes physically obvious before mental reasoning arrives to justify it. It feels like the action is slightly ahead of your awareness, as if you are catching up to something that has already been determined. This is not impulsivity. It is not random behavior. It is the result of a deeper layer of processing where outcomes are already organized before they surface into conscious thought. The mind is no longer the origin point of initiation. It is becoming a receiver of completed internal instructions. You may experience this as a strange familiarity with new actions. Even when something is happening for the first time in your external life, internally it does not feel unfamiliar. It carries a sense of having already been lived through in a quieter dimension of awareness. Not memory in the traditional sense, but a pre-structured pattern that your system recognizes as already complete. This is where the sensation of pre-remembered action begins to form. The action is not being invented at the moment. It feels as if it has already occurred in potential form, and your physical body is simply aligning with the version that is now being selected. Hesitation begins to weaken in a very specific way, not through force, not through discipline, but through irrelevance. Hesitation requires a gap between decision and execution. But when action feels pre-known, that gap collapses. There is less internal debate because the system does not experience multiple competing options at the same intensity anymore. What arises is a quiet certainty that does not require explanation. You are not convincing yourself to act. You are recognizing that the action is already structurally in motion. The role of the mind becomes minimal, almost observational, as if it is watching a script unfold that it did not write, but is now able to read clearly. Even complex decisions begin to simplify. Not because the world becomes simpler, but because the number of viable directions reduces automatically. The system has already filtered out what does not match the internal configuration, leaving only actions that feel internally coherent. What remains does not need to be debated, it only needs to be followed. This is also where effort begins to detach from action itself. You may still move, speak, or engage, but it no longer feels like you are pushing yourself into those movements. Instead, action feels like continuation, as if something was already in motion before you arrived at awareness, and you are simply staying aligned with its flow. Even mistakes begin to feel different here. When an action does not produce the expected outcome, it does not create the same internal rupture it once did. There is less identification with the idea that I made a wrong choice, because the sense of authorship has shifted. Action is no longer experienced as a fragile personal construction. It is experienced as part of a larger unfolding process that includes correction as naturally as direction. As this stabilizes, life begins to feel less like a series of decisions and more like a sequence of recognitions. You are not constantly choosing from scratch. You are recognizing what has already been arranged at a deeper level and allowing it to move into expression through you. This is the core of pre-remembered action, the feeling that nothing is truly being started anymore. Only revealed. Only continued. Only brought into visibility from a layer that was already complete before awareness arrived. And once this becomes familiar, something irreversible changes in your relationship with control. You stop treating action as something you must generate and start experiencing it as something you align with. Not because you have lost agency, but because agency has shifted deeper than the surface where effort and hesitation used to exist. From this point onward, life does not feel like you are constantly beginning things. It feels like you are stepping into what has already begun, the quiet occupation of the deeper self. This internal shift, something settles that cannot be described as improvement, transformation, or growth. Those words are too active, too loud for what is actually happening. What takes place here is quieter than change. It is more like occupation, slow, complete, and irreversible, but without force. It does not arrive with intensity. It does not announce itself. There is no dramatic moment where you feel becoming something new. Instead, there is a gradual realization that something deeper has already taken residence in the background of your being. And what you used to call you is no longer the primary operating center. This deeper self is not another personality layer. It is not an upgraded version of the mind. It is a different level of organization altogether, one that does not rely on thought to stabilize identity. It exists beneath interpretation, beneath emotional reaction, beneath the need to constantly define what is happening. You may only notice the effects. Less internal fragmentation. Fewer contradictory impulses pulling you in different directions. A strange reduction in unnecessary self-interference, not because life becomes simpler, but because the internal system is no longer overcrowded with competing internal authorities. The most important shift here is authority relocation. The surface mind still exists, still speaks, still reacts, but it is no longer the center that determines what is real, what is important, or what must be acted upon. That authority has already moved deeper into a layer that does not argue, does not hesitate, and does not require justification. Because of this, life begins to feel unusually stable from the inside. Not emotionally stable in a forced or maintained way, but structurally stable. like something in the background has already settled into its correct position and no longer needs adjustment. You may notice that your reactions lose their sharp edges. Situations still arise, but they no longer fully pull you into them. There is a distance that is not emotional detachment, but structural separation. You are present, but not absorbed. Involved, but not consumed. Thoughts continue to appear, but they no longer feel like commands. They feel more like passing signals that are either relevant or irrelevant to the deeper layer already in place. Some thoughts pass through without impact. Others are recognized instantly and translated into quiet action without internal debate. This is where the occupation becomes noticeable, not in what increases, but in what stops interfering. The deeper self does not dominate. It replaces unnecessary noise with simplicity. It does not compete with the mind. It bypasses the need for competition altogether. Even your sense of identity begins to loosen. The constant internal referencing of who I am or how I am doing starts to fade into the background. Not because identity disappears, but because it is no longer constantly reconstructed. It becomes something stable enough not to require continuous confirmation. Presence feels different. It is no longer something you try to achieve through focus. It is what remains when internal resistance is no longer organizing your attention. You are here without effort, without self-monitoring, without the need to constantly adjust your experience of being here. What emerges in its place is a quiet continuity. Actions flow without interruption from excessive reflection. Decisions arise without internal fragmentation. Even silence feels structured, not empty. And perhaps the most subtle change of all is this: you stop feeling like you are inside yourself trying to manage life. Instead, it feels like life is unfolding through a system that is already organized, already occupied, already running on a deeper configuration that does not require supervision. Not because something ends, but because something no longer needs to be maintained. The deeper self is not becoming active. It has already taken its place. And what remains is not effort, not struggle, not transformation, but simple alignment with what is already quietly in command. And now you notice something unmistakable. You are no longer trying to become aligned. You are already operating from alignment. The noise that once defined your decisions doesn't disappear, it simply loses authority. A quieter intelligence continues to move everything forward without effort, without debate, without delay. Nothing about your outer world may look dramatically different yet, but the source behind every choice is no longer the same. A deeper layer is running the system now. And it doesn't need confirmation. It only needs your willingness to stay out of its way.